I'm from the University of Durham. That's the picture of the university up there. Just a minute. My own personal background is set out there. And I have a very long-standing interest in doctoral education. It goes back to my own experiences as a research student half a century ago, when I had a supervisor who was laissez-faire, and unfortunately, I was a student who needed a lot more guidance and support. So it turned out to be quite a traumatic experience. I survived it, and I got a lectureship at Warwick, and I'd been in it for a year, came back after a summer break to be told I'd got my first research student, which sent me into a flat panic because I had no role model from my own supervisor. In those days, there wasn't anything in the way of professional development, and there was nothing in the way of literature either. So it was very much a case of learning on the job. I fear to some extent at the expense of my students. So when a few years later I switched into academic development, I decided to specialize in supervision, and I've worked with supervisors from many universities in the UK. You'll see that very deliberately elsewhere in Europe. We may have left the European Union, but we're still part of Europe and the Far East. Currently, I'm the chair of the UK Council for Graduate Education's Research Supervisor Network. Recently put its good supervisory practice framework into place, and I have implemented its supervisor recognition scheme, whereby supervisors can apply for recognition through the council. I've also got research and publications in doctoral education. These are some of the recent papers. Of them, I think the one that's excited the most attention is the third one with the Kumars, A Guide to Online Supervision, which has been downloaded a lot in the pandemic. And then also there are a couple of books, that the Handbook for Doctoral Supervisors, the second edition of which was publicized in 2018. And then the one I want to talk about more today, The Making of Doctoral Supervisors, which was published earlier this year. What I'd like to do, sorry, my current projects, I've got two. One is with Vijay Kumar in University of Otago in New Zealand, and Sharon Sharmini of University of Putra, Malaysia. It's a study of the examination of doctorate in 20 countries, and you'll be glad to know that one of the contributors is Pierre. So I'm looking forward to reading his chapter on France in the near future. And then the project I've just started, which with Margaret Kiley from ANU and Carrie Holly, University of Alabama, is again a 20-country study, but it's of the impact of COVID-19 on doctoral education, because the national responses have been very, very different indeed, and hence the implications for the student experience have been very different as well. So that's far too much about me, actually. Let's then go on to the project. What I want to do is to talk about the background to the project, to why we undertook it in the first place, the project itself and how it was designed and implemented, the key findings we got from that 20-country study, the analysis, the way in which we analyzed those key findings using a model of education, and then finally the conclusions that we came to. I'm going to have breaks in here for questions, but just to say that if any of you do have any pressing questions, please feel free to interject. If you can unmic yourselves and then I can hear you, I'm very, very happy to take questions as I go, if that's okay. So let's go back to the background to the whole project. And essentially, it's based on three propositions. The first one is that doctoral education is important. It's more important now than it's probably ever been, for reasons which I think have been well explained in the paper by Loxley and Cairns. I'll leave you to read that. This has been a global phenomenon then. The second proposition is that doctoral supervision is important. And there have been numerous studies showing that the quality of supervision is and in many cases, the major factor in determining the learning experiences of doctoral candidates and their chances of timely completion. And there's just a small selection of the literature to do with that particular topic there. The third proposition is that in recent years, doctoral supervision has become much more complex and much more demanding than it was in the past. Historically, there's a quote there from Manathunga and Nguzi. The key qualification to be a good supervisor was to be research active. It was underpinned in the sciences by the master-apprentice model, which assumed a one-way transmission belt between doctoral supervisors experts to candidates as novices. And then in the arts and humanities, social sciences, it was a laissez-faire model where supervisors expected students to undertake work themselves. Over the past 3 decades, there have been massive changes, which following some work by Hammond et al., I've clustered into 4 different types of changes, which are formalization, growth, diversification, welfare, diversification of purposes of doctor, diversification of modes of study. And if I may, I would like to spend some time just looking at these changes and the way in which they have changed supervision over the past 2 or 3 decades. We start with formalization. I have 5 components of formalization, which I've called commodification, McDonaldization, regulation, collectivization, and structuration. If we start with the process of commodification, traditionally, as we've just said, the relationship was master-apprentice. There you can see the master teaching, in this case, apprentices, or laissez-faire, let them get on with it. But in the same way as there has been a marketization of undergraduate education and a move to encourage undergraduates to consider themselves as consumers, the same has been true in terms of graduate education. And just to try and illustrate this, I've got a couple of examples. This one is from the 1980s. It's a part-time student. I'll lead you to read it. The whole point of this is that the student, he didn't get the degree, he got a master's degree, and he just accepted the situation as it was, despite what I would argue is very clear evidence of negligence even by the supervisor. Contrast that to, this is a case from 2018 involving SOAS, the School of African Oriental Studies, Oriental African Studies rather, of the University of London. This is a quote from the Times Higher Education. So in this case, the institution failed to provide adequate supervision. The student took them to court and was awarded damages. And this is, I think, a good illustration of the way in which, rather than, if things start going wrong, rather than necessarily, at any rate, blaming themselves, doctoral candidates are these days quite likely to look at legal implications of what is going on. And that has altered the relationship between supervisor and student to some extent. So that's the first one. The second part of this, and this is not my original, so this was taken from elsewhere, the so-called McDonaldization of doctoral education. Get them in, get them through, and get them out. Historically, it didn't particularly matter how long doctoral candidates took. The quote says there from Renee Simpson, as long as they paid their fees, stayed around long enough, nobody worried too much about how long they took. Then in the late 70s, 1980s, governments across the globe began collecting statistics on completion rates and times. These are actually quite interesting because studies in Western Europe, in the States, in Australia and New Zealand found consistently that only about half completed at all, and of those, relatively few completed within 3 or 4 years. So the question was, what's going on? This is the highest level of study. Half the students are either failing or dropping out. Others are taking a very long time to complete. So governments across the globe responded. I've got 4 examples here, which have been drawn deliberately from Europe. In the UK, state research funds introduced target completion rates and penalties for institutions or departments which did not meet them. Typically, the completion rate was 75% within 4 years, and if they didn't meet it, the departments were debarred from having new research students for a further 2-year period. In Sweden in 1988, they introduced a 4-year legal limit of funding. So you could have 4 years of funding. If it took you beyond that, then either you or the institution had got to find the funding from another source. Norway took a rather different stance, a name and shame one, whereby the ministry set targets of PhD completions and then publishes the actual completions in institutions against the benchmarks. And then Spain, it was a really tight one here, brought in a decree limiting the completion date for 5 years. And if you failed to submit on time, you had to start again, basically, which proved a very strong incentive. Again, the point about this is it places great pressures on students, of which more later, but it also places great stresses on supervisors in terms of getting candidates through within that time. And I should add that in countries like the UK, where the authorities have refused really to acknowledge the impact of COVID upon completions, it's causing really serious problems as students are struggling and their supervisors are struggling to try and get them through within the same time as before the pandemic set in. A further feature, one of the most marked ones across Europe, has been the structuration of doctoral education. Traditionally, individual programs of study determined independently by the supervisor and the candidate. We now, of course, have doctoral curricula, we have doctoral programs. They often include taught program components which have to be passed before you can progress to the research part of the degree. And doctoral studies are taking place within institutional structures, graduate school, Germany, graduate colleges, doctoral training centers, etc. So there is now a structure around doctoral education, which there wasn't there before, which supervisors have to know, understand, and be able to respond to. The next element of formalization has been the regulation of doctoral education. Traditionally, research supervision has been seen as a lovely metaphor here as a secret garden. A secret garden, I'll leave you to read that. The next passage in that quote, which I haven't got up here, is "That world is no more." Because we all now have national quality assurance systems for higher education generally, but also including doctoral education. We have monitoring of the quality of doctoral education, and in response to this, universities have developed internal systems for the quality assurance of doctoral education. And again, supervisors have got to understand what the requirements are in terms of the institution, and they've got to meet them. And those requirements can be quite onerous. This is from a survey, I'm sorry, it's the most recent data I could get hold of, 2013, an EUA survey of quality assurance in doctoral education across a wide range of institutions in Europe. And you can see that even then, eight years ago, over half had a maximum number of students per supervisor to try and keep the workload down. 30% had obligatory training and 45% voluntary training. I suspect those figures will actually be quite different now. I think the obligatory training will be rather higher. 60% had a minimum number of meetings per year. 60% had a requirement for supervisory teams. 60% a requirement for written agreements about the project itself and how, when, and where it was to be undertaken. 65% arrangements for conflict resolution between supervisors and students, and again 65% with student feedback. So again, this alters the world in which supervisors operate. The next change is that I've called collectivization. Historically, the model was of a single supervisor, Dr. Vater or Dr. Mutter, working with the research student. And that's got the advantages of a single line of responsibility and a single source of support and guidance for the candidate. But it also has risks attached to it if one person, if the supervisor is negligent, or if the relationship doesn't work, or if something happens to the supervisor, if he or she moves or otherwise changes things. So there's been a move towards team supervision, and it's actually, this move has been pretty well now across Europe to try and introduce multiple lines of responsibility and multiple sources of support and guidance. So there are pluses, but you can also have the problems of stemming from a ménage à trois or more. And I've got a well-known cartoon there from Piled Higher and Deeper of your thesis committee. So you've got your professor, simultaneously your biggest ally and your worst enemy. The guru, only here for the free cookies. The adversary, who's at odds with the supervisor. The straw man or woman, nice guy, no opinions. And then my favorite, the assistance professor, still doesn't believe that just a few months ago they were on the other side, just like you, pretends to be an adult. The point is it illustrates quite graphically the problems that can occur in terms of collective supervision. And that, of course, means that you demands more skills of supervisors to manage supervisory teams. Another change has been in institutional collaboration, that we are being encouraged to collaborate both within countries and between countries. I've got here just one example of a doctoral training centre in which my own university, Durham, is involved in the northeast of England and in Northern Ireland. As you can see, there are 6 institutions, each with their own rules and regulations. And it's quite interesting that there are many issues in terms of the impact of these different rules and regulations upon supervisors. I should add that, of course, there are many cross-national collaborations as well, and there can be issues there with supervisors, and there can also be, for example, issues with examination, because the models of examination differ so much between European countries. That's formalization. The second set I've called growth, diversification, and obligation. This has the 4 key elements of massification, international diversification, domestic diversification, and then obligation for candidates' well-being and mental health. In terms of massification, there's a quote there from Joyner: historically, very few people, mostly of high attainment and motivation, undertook research degrees. But over the past 2 decades or so, there's been a rapid expansion of numbers. I've dug out some figures here for some of the major providers of doctoral education across the globe, from 2000 to 2015. And you can see the highest one is China, where the 250% increase in the numbers of doctoral students, closely followed by Korea with 228. Then Australia, it doubled. Canada, it nearly doubled. And so it goes on. USA, UK, it was 50%. USA, 35%. And so it goes on. There was basically globally, the numbers of doctoral candidates doubled between 2000 and 2015, which means, of course, that you've got many more students to supervise. And that brings into issues like group supervision as opposed to just individual supervision, how you manage those higher numbers. The second big change was internationalization. There's a long history of the international mobility of scholars, excuse me, and I have 3 examples here. The one on the left is obviously Erasmus, who studied at 4 European universities. The one in the middle, again, obviously, is Marie Curie-Skłodowska, who was educated privately, as it happened, in Poland, and then moved to France, where she did the work which led to her becoming the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize, and still the only person to receive Nobel Prizes for both chemistry and physics. And on the right there is a great political theorist who was born in Latvia in 1906, who moved to St. Petersburg in 1917, who then moved very quickly to the UK. She came to at the age of 11 with no English. At the age of 18, he went to the University of Oxford and he became the Chichelet Professor of Political Theory and arguably one of the foremost Western European political theorists of the 20th century. So there's a long history there. But there has been a change in recent years with pull and push factors. Pull factors, the knowledge economy that we've just mentioned. The other one, the reputation and resources for research in the Northern Hemisphere in particular. On the other hand, the push factors, the expansion of undergraduate education globally, which has led to more people becoming eligible for graduate education. In many countries, capacity constraints on postgraduate education. One of the biggest, of course, is the number of supervisors. You get this situation where countries have very small numbers of people who actually got doctors who can supervise, and because they've got small numbers who can supervise, they can't take on more doctoral students, and it ratchets round and round and round. And I think one of the key issues in doctoral education at this point in time is how we support countries to break through that cycle. And then the final thing, which is particularly in China and India, the emergence of middle classes with money who can afford to send their children abroad to be educated. Well, the result of that has been that the postgraduate population in many countries has become very heavily international. This is, again, it's the latest data I can get from UNESCO. You can see there in France, 42% of doctoral candidates were from outside France. New Zealand and the UK just behind on 41%, Netherlands 39%, and so it goes on. What the figures would look like now with the COVID emergency, I don't know, to be honest. I suspect they'd be considerably lower, but certainly one thing I've often said in this country, pointed out to supervisors, is that roughly 1 in 2 of your research students will be from outside the UK. And the point is there that they've been socialized into different systems, sometimes with different expectations. And then you get the real complication. Given the international mobility of faculty, you can have supervisors from 2 different systems, 2 different approaches to higher education generally and doctoral education, and a candidate from a third. And the dynamics of that are quite mind-boggling on some occasions. So that's, again, a problem with supervisors. How do you manage these issues? Sorry, another trend has been domestic diversification. There's a quote there from a study done in Denmark by Peterson. I'll leave you to read that. sorry. So the story of the past 2 decades or so has been one whereby the population of doctoral candidates has diversified very considerably. I think you can probably see it best in terms of gender. If you go back to 2000, you find that between 20 and 25% of doctoral candidates in Europe were female. If you go there today, I think it's true to say that there isn't a single country in Europe where women are not majority. They're the majority across Europe of doctoral candidates. That's been one change in terms of gender. It's not yet been a change that's been reflected so much in the supervisor population, and there can be issues arising from gender complications there. There have been other progress in terms of students with disabilities. There have been students from ethnic, racial, minority groups. Again, there's been progress. That progress has been far less marked than with women. And I think there are, I don't think offhand, there are any European countries where there is proportionate representation of students from ethnic and racial minorities among the doctoral candidate population. That's an area we still got to work on. But again, it does create issues, or can create issues. And then under this heading, the next one is obligation. And this is very much something of the past 3, 4, 5 years. An obligation for wellbeing mental health. Traditionally, the views doctoral candidates were adults responsible for their own well-being and mental health. But there is recent international evidence, particularly from Belgium, from the UK, and from the Netherlands, that doctoral candidates suffer disproportionately from low level of well-being, depression and anxiety, but also mental illness, clinical depression, as well as more severe illnesses such as bipolar and psychosis. The causes are complex, but there are kind of, in a very, very crude sense, there are 2 models. One is that recruiting more graduate students means more of them have well-being mental health issues. That's one of them. The other one, and the really disturbing one in my view, is that the pressures of doctoral level work, loneliness, boredom, bad relationships sometimes with supervisors, financial difficulties, harassment, career uncertainties, are actually driving students into problems with their well-being and with their mental health. Either way, the interpretation has been that institutions are seen as having an obligation for well-being and the mental health of their students. And who's in the forefront? I leave you to read the quote. And certainly one thing we spent a lot of time doing in the UK is devising training programs and training materials for supervisors to be able to spot the signs of mental health issues, not under any search to try and deal with them, but to be able to point students in the right direction for professional support. The third big area is diversification of modes of study. And there are 2 things in here. Firstly, casualization. Now, people have studied part-time for a long time, including that guy in the picture, who is, of course, Einstein, who did his thesis while he was working in the patent office in Basel. He was a part-time research student. The reason he was a part-time research student, he started off full-time. He put his thesis in, it was turned down. He put another thesis in, which was turned down. He then had no more money, hence the trip to Basel. He then put a third thesis in. The examiners complained it was too long. His proud boast was he altered 1 word, took out 1 word and put it in again. And then he got the thesis there. Published in the Annals of Physics for 1906. And it's a paper that proved the existence of atoms. So you can do it part-time, but what's happened now is that it's becoming a pattern in not all, but in many countries, a combination of debt, lack of research grants has led to delayed entry to research degree programs, and in many countries, students studying part-time while they're employed. And that can create tremendous problems, obviously, because of the conflict between roles. So that's one aspect. The other one is dislocation, studying off campus. Again, traditionally studied on campus. Many are now studying off campus. With COVID, there's been absolutely no alternative. And you can see there's a quote there: when there's such minimal face-to-face contact, getting to know the student can be very challenging for both student and supervisor. It's a challenge that we've had to face over the past two years with COVID. And it's one, in my view, that the evidence I have seen so far that supervisors have risen to very well indeed. That it seems to me that they've got a grip on how to deal with students at a distance to a much greater extent than I'd ever have thought possible previously. Again, the evidence from students is they would still, in many cases, prefer more face-to-face contact, but it's quite interesting that there seems to be very little demand for a full return to face-to-face contact. I've just included, if anyone's interested, a reference to a guide we wrote a year or so ago on online supervision, which is available free for downloading from the UK Council of Graduate Education website. The final area is the diversification of purposes. And there's three here: cross-fertilization, proliferation, and capitalization. Cross-fertilization, many of the problems across the globe require the application of more than one discipline. So what's been happening is an increasing number of doctoral projects have been in cross-disciplinary fields. If supervisors are steeped in their own discipline, supervising can be, as Manathunga et al. Have written, cognitively, emotionally, and socially threatening work. It can be very difficult. I just perhaps give you one example of a student I know who's working in the realm of nudge theory, the idea that you can nudge people to make quite big changes in their behavior. They start off small and then become larger. And it's an area that transcends psychology and economics. There was one student who had a supervisor from psychology, but she was from the biological end of psychology, and another supervisor from economics, but he was from the mathematical end of economics. And they had no common language. The student had the job of trying to create a common language between them. And the supervisors then, of course, had the job of finding a common language. And it proved a very, very difficult passage. The student got there in the end, but difficult for her and difficult for the supervisors as well. Another thing has been the proliferation of doctoral awards. I've just got some examples there. This is from the UK. We apparently now have somewhere in the region of 360 different doctoral awards of one kind or another. And we have, firstly, the professional doctorates, the Doctor of Education, Doctor of Clinical Psychology, of course, Doctor of Business Administration as well. They are very prominent in the UK, less prominent necessarily elsewhere in Europe. There are, of course, some in France, in the Netherlands, and in Belgium in particular, but they've not caught on the way they have in the Anglo-American countries. The second thing, and this is common across Europe now, are practice-led doctorates, whereby the output is an artifact. It could be a sculpture, a painting, an exhibition, a dance, a symphony, whatever, as well as a commentary on how it was created and how that is original. The third thing, doctorates by publication. You've got doctorates by prior publication, which are common across Europe. Increasingly, we're having doctorates by contemporaneous publication, where supervisors are having to support students to get enough papers in reputable journals to qualify. And then we have the industrial doctorates, doctorates conducted. It may not be industry, it could be the public sector, it could be the non-profit sector, etc. But the point about all these lot is they can create problems for supervisors, particularly if, as so many of us have just done PhDs ourselves. So professional doctorates, you've got to understand the profession to which they're trying to make a contribution. Practice-led doctorates, I still don't know how they define standards. How can you define a standard for a concerto or a dance or something there? And so how as a supervisor, can you advise your student, yeah, submit that, that's good. Doctorates by publication, you have to know which journals to orientate students towards, how to support them to write for those particular journals, support them through the inevitable cases whereby their papers are rejected or substantially rewritten, etc., and try and do all of that within the same period of time as it with a normal PhD, and also cope with publication time lags. It can be 18 months, 2 years or more. Industrial doctorates, you've got the issue of dealing with supervisors who often do not have PhDs themselves, often have a relatively limited understanding of the academic implications of it. And on the contrary, they believe that academics have very limited understanding of the commercial implications of doctorates. And there is, of course, a whole literature looking at the issues in managing those doctorates. The final area of diversification of purposes is capitalization. Traditional purpose of the doctorate, the Humboldtian doctorate, started in Berlin in 1810, was to train academic researchers. But from the 1990s onwards, you've had an increase in doctoral graduates, which has far outpaced the increase in academic posts, at least in the developed economies. Interesting, there are some signs that even in the developing economies, the number of graduates is outpacing the number of jobs at the moment. Another change has been that more older academics have continued in their post. Some very interesting research in America suggests that since they lifted the ban on academics having to retire at 65, about 10 years ago and so on, they reckon the number who stayed on has shrunk the market for new jobs by about 15%. And then the other thing is that academic employment has lost its attractiveness to many early career researchers. There's a reason there from Merrill Quake. And these are the latest figures I've been able to get about the percentage of PhDs going into tenure track posts. And you can see it's high in Finland, 40%, Switzerland, 34%, Belgium and Netherlands, 30%, the US, 25%, the UK, it's 19%. So the question then is, if the purpose of doctorate is not to train academics, what was it? Well, what's happened is its purpose has been redefined in terms of producing human capital for the knowledge economies. I've got a definition there of the link between PhD production and knowledge economy from Pedersen. So PhD production is now inextricably bound up with the knowledge economy and with economic growth. And this has affected the doctorate in itself. I've actually quoted myself here. I don't normally do this, but again, I leave you to read this part and the next one. If I go over. So it's that last phrase, the traditional PhD was about producing academics, but the new knowledge economy required research entrepreneurs. And those research entrepreneurs are required to have a whole range of knowledge and skills. This is the outline of the knowledge, skills, etc., 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 that are expected from researchers in the UK. And as you can see, there are a very large number of attributes there. If you go on the VITAE, VITAE website, you can get this up in detail. I think it's about 27 pages of qualities that researchers are supposed to have. And again, that has an impact on supervisors. A quote here from a study by Johnson. So we now have responsibilities in terms of careers as well. I've summarized these up in a single slide there, which has got, as you can see, the 4 categories down the left-hand side, and then the traditional Humboldtian doctorate, the doctorate that was around from 1810 really until the late 20th century, then the various processes that we've described, and then what I've described as the modern doctorate. All of these changes have got implications for supervision. So this again is a quote from Griffith and Warren. What seemed a relatively simple role that could learn experientially, a role played out within a secret garden or a private space, has now become a highly complex set of roles. It's supposed to be learned quickly and then played out within a multi-featured landscape and molded by a variety of influential stakeholders. And these changes have been notified by supervisors. I'm quoting here from an old study in 2010. I'm hopeful in about 6 weeks' time to quote from a very large UK study of 3,500 supervisors. But this is one that in this study, supervisors testified to the changes in their work. I'll leave you to read the rest of that. So you've got all these changes. The rationale for the book, which I'm now returning to, despite the importance of a doctorate, national policymakers, the crucial roles of supervisors in doctoral completion and success, and the increased complexity of supervision and the increased demands on supervisors, the comparative literature on doctoral education has paid very little attention to the ways in which doctoral supervisors are selected, supported, and recognized and rewarded for their efforts. And that's essentially the background to the book, to correct that. But I'm going to stop at this juncture and ask, are there any questions? Are there any issues you'd like to raise before I go on to look at the study of the making of doctoral supervisors? Okay, in that case, I'll go on again. I say if you want to interject, by all means do so. Right, the project then that we conceived of, the aim was to compare and to contrast arrangements for doctoral supervisors in a sample of doctoral awarding institutions across the globe. 3 objectives: to find out how they were selected, what were the eligibility criteria, how were they supported in terms of professional development and mentoring, and how, if and how, doctoral supervision was recognised and rewarded. Those are the objectives. It was a collaboration between 3 editors: Margaret Kiley of Australian National University, Carrie Holly of the University of Alabama, and myself. And essentially, Margaret took care of Asia and Oceania. Carrie took care of the States and Latin America, and I did the rest. For case studies, we ideally wanted a weighted representative sample of doctorate awarding countries from all of the major countries, including both large and small providers. So we needed an indication at the time. Things have changed now. The only indicator we could find was the number of doctoral graduates. So the first thing we had to do was to map the distribution of doctoral graduates across the world. Excluding the Vatican, there are 195 countries in the world, and according to UniRank, 15 had no provision for doctoral education. Significantly, 8 of those were in sub-Saharan Africa. Then, using UNESCO, World Bank, OECD data, and any other source I could find, we looked for data on graduates in the remaining 180. Couldn't get any data for 31, 14 of which were in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, that's significant. So we actually ended up with 149 cases, doctoral graduates in 2017, or in a few cases, 2016. And we clustered these into kind of 8 regions of the world. We started off with North America, which involves, in this case, Greenland, the States, Canada, and Mexico, which collectively were responsible for 18% of doctoral graduations in 2017. We then went to South America, responsible for 5.9% of doctoral graduations. Then to Sub-Saharan Africa, which was the real surprise, that Sub-Saharan Africa has 14% of the world's population. It has 2% of doctoral graduations. Then to Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, a part of Papua New Guinea, 2.1%. Then to Asia, which was 28.6%, by far the largest region as a region there. Then to Arabia and North Africa and the Middle East, responsible for 5.8%, which is actually more than we'd expected, which mainly reflected, as you'll see in a minute, a large doctoral population in Iran. Then we had Russia and Eastern Europe, responsible for 12.1%, and then finally Europe, 25.6% altogether. So that was the global distribution. I believe this is the first time that it's been mapped. So we then had to go about trying to get examples from each country. The idea was one from each region, pro rata beyond that, and a balance of large and small. It was not difficult for North America. We got both Canada and the United States as a big producer. That was good. In South America, 5.9% of the world total. Of that, 4.3%, 80%, is one country, which is Brazil. So we chose Brazil as the example for that one. The one we had real problems with was Sub-Saharan Africa, and the problem was actually finding somebody who could write about these particular countries. And eventually we ended up, as has almost every other study so far, in just including South Africa, which is responsible for 0.6%. It's a third of the total of Sub-Saharan graduates. For Oceania, excuse me, Australia, 1.6% of the 2.1% produced by that region. In Asia, we had the biggest producer there, which is, of course, China, followed by India, and then we had Japan on the right there and South Korea. In North Africa and the Middle East, annoyingly, we couldn't at the time get data on Egypt, which is probably the biggest producer in that region, but we did manage to get it on Turkey and Iran. For the Russia and Eastern Europe, we got Russia itself 5.6% of the total, and then Poland 0.8%. And then in Western Europe, it was relatively easy because of plenty of people who could write information there. So as you can see, we had excuse me, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, France, the UK, Ireland, Italy, and Spain. Excuse me, sorry. The sample we had, it geographically overrepresents Asia and Western Europe, underrepresents the others. In terms of size, it overrepresents larger, underrepresents smaller, but collectively the countries were responsible for about 3/4 of global output of doctoral graduates in 2017. I mean, I think that's quite a statement in itself that these 20 countries out of the 140 odd that we got data on accounted for, only 20 countries accounted for 3/4 of doctoral graduates. We then got contributors, and I'm very pleased to say that Pierre Bateau was one of them. He wrote a very good chapter for that book. We had 29 contributors from 21 different countries. And they were all asked to write about how supervisors were selected, the criteria which were used to define eligibility, how they were supported, opportunities for professional development and mentoring, and if and how supervision was recognized and rewarded. So in terms of the key findings that we got, we start with selection criteria. First one, possession of a doctorate. And there are good arguments for believing that examiner or supervisor should have completed a doctorate themselves, so they got an understanding of what's involved and of the standards for the award. It's interesting that of the 21 countries that we ended up with, it was an absolute requirement in 17, and in 3 of them, France, Germany, and Poland, you needed the second, the higher doctorate, the habilitation as well. But interestingly, in 4 countries, Canada, China, Japan, and the UK, it was possible to supervise without the degree, subject to having equivalent research experience or relevant professional qualifications and experience as well. So 17 out of 21 insisted that they had a doctorate. A second was employment status. Again, you'd expect that supervisors would have to be tenured staff in the institutions where they were supervising. And in 18 countries, that was the case. You had to be permanent staff. But in 2 others, Australia and the UK, non-tenured staff, that's staff usually on short-term research contracts, were allowed to supervise, provided their contracts exceeded the duration of the candidacy. The exception here to the rule was South Africa, where the primary requirement was just to have a PhD, and because of a shortage of academic supervisors, they could be recruited from organizations outside higher education. And as I've read up more on sub-Saharan African subsequently, that's not unique to South Africa. It is not uncommon within that region. It's not uncommon in some cases not to have a PhD at all. The third one is currently research active. So the idea, this is a traditional one, working at the cutting edge of your discipline to offer advice and support to doctoral scholars. It seems an essential precondition. And it was in 19 of the case studies where evidence of being research active, recent publications or grants, or in some cases an H-index were required. The exceptions were South Africa, where supervisors didn't necessarily have to be research active, and the UK, where this was not explicitly stated as a requirement in many of the institutions. But internationally, that was common. Fourth one, and again a very obvious one, expertise in the subject matter of the student's research project. And there are a number of studies suggest stress that supervisors need to have knowledge of the subject matter and expertise, particularly in research methods, in order to offer them appropriate support and direction. And again, requirement for sole and principal supervisors in 19 of those 21 case studies. The exceptions, Australia, where it wasn't necessarily the case for the arts, humanities and social sciences, but was for STEM. And the UK again, where an exception, this was not a stated requirement in many institutions. Excuse me. The fifth is previous experience of supervision. There's an interesting argument here. You can learn many aspects of supervision through professional development, but there is a view that it's also a craft, that there are elements that can only be learned by actually doing it. And for this reason, principal supervisors may be required to get some experience before becoming eligible to become a full supervisor. I should say second supervisors, not principal. Within the set of case studies, 9 had such a requirement. But in 2, Brazil and Turkey, the requirement was supervising students at the master's level prior to scaling up to the doctorate one. In 3, China, Iran, and Russia, be master's level or as a junior co-supervisor doctoral level. In many institutions in Canada, you had to have such experience, and it was mandatory in most institutions in Australia, Ireland, and the UK. A 6th point was capacity. Again, there are a number of studies that have shown that supervisors need to have adequate time to spend with students in order to ensure they have a good experience and complete on time. So for this reason, limits may be set on the numbers of doctoral scholars students are allowed to work with. Interesting, of the 21 countries, there were 7 where institutions had such limits. In 4 of them, Iran, Russia, South Africa, and the UK, some had such limits, and in a further 3, Australia, India, and Turkey, limits were the norm across all the institutions. But I say interesting that 14 of those countries didn't have that model. A 7th thing was completion of mandatory initial professional development programs. There are 2 major studies, in particular that one by McCulloch and Lursa in 2016, have shown that completing a professional development program can help to enhance both the competence of supervisors and the experience of doctoral scholars. However, mandatory professional development programs were only commonly found in 3 of the countries studied, which were Australia, Sweden, and the UK. Another thing was being mentored through 1 or more supervisory cycles. A way of supporting new supervisors is to appoint an experienced senior supervisor to assist them in understanding the process and taking them through 1 or more supervisory cycles. Again, this is relatively rare among the countries studied, that only the mandatory mentoring schemes in 3 of the countries, which were Australia, Ireland, and the UK. And then the final one was mandatory completion of continuing professional development programs. We've seen doctoral education has been in the throes of change for the last 30 years. And there's a quote there, a consequence of this decreasing relevance of supervisors' own experiences for supervision in the 21st century, and hence the need for supervisors to develop new practices. So for that reason, they require updating, but this was very rare. There were only 3 countries where we found it to any great extent, which were Australia, Denmark, and the UK. So that was supervisor eligibility. In terms of supervisor support, we found 6 of the case studies, all bar Canada, 6 of the case studies had, the majority of institutions had mandatory or voluntary initial professional development programs. In a further 4, provision in a minority of institutions, but in the rest of them, including the United States, there was little, if any, provision at all. Continuing professional development, in 6 countries, there was some provision, usually voluntary, but this was absent in the other 15 institutions. And then mentoring, was a feature voluntarily in 5 of the case studies: Australia, Canada, Russia, and the UK. And then the final category we had was recognition and reward. We found that in 10 of the case studies, supervising research student was included in the criteria for academic promotion. And in some, at least one successful supervision was a requirement for a full professorship. And then another indicator we looked at was at awards for excellence in doctoral supervision. And we found in 6 countries, some institutions were recorded as having awards, whereas in France, supervisors could apply for awards under the research and doctoral support bonus scheme. But again, it's interesting, in 11 of those countries, they were not included in the criteria for academic promotion. And in 14 of those countries, there was no reward for being a supervisor in terms of excellence awards or extra grants, etc. That was what we found. We then analysed it, and we thought there was almost a common core in terms of the criteria to be eligible to supervise, but in other respects, there were significant variations in the ways in which national education systems approach the support and reward of supervisors. And we analysed these using a notion of professionality, which was set out some years ago by Lynn Evans of the University of Leeds. And she defined professionality in terms of the assumptions, as you say, ideological, attitudinal, intellectual, epistemological, which underpinned conceptions of professional practice. And she represented it as a continuum, with at one end practice conceived of narrowly in terms of experiential and intuitively based roles, and at the other more broadly defined in terms of requirements for professional knowledge and skills. And she described these as the restricted and extended profiles of professionality. What we did was to translate this into supervision. And in terms of the restricted pole, we thought this was represented by the traditional view that, as Ernest Rudd summarized it many years ago, if one can do research, then presumably one can supervise it. So the necessary and sufficient condition is to be research active. And it would follow from that, there was no need for professional development, or given it's an adjunct of research, for reward and recognition. At the other extreme, there is the extended profile of professionality, which we think is being described well by Atkins and Brown. I'll leave you to read that passage. So that we thought was the extended pole. What we then did, at that pole, being research active is a necessary condition, it's not a sufficient one. A sufficient one, you need to have the additional knowledge, understanding, and skills. And the implication of that one is that to be effective, active researchers need extended professionalities, and this should be supported by professional development and knowledge through recognition and reward. We applied this to the case studies, and it's fair to say none of them were found to fit the poles exactly. What we did was divide them up into 3 clusters. Cluster 1 was near the restricted pole, where there was little support for professional development and little, if any, recognition and reward. And we found that 10 of our 21 cases came into that category, as you see, including Brazil, China, India, Iran, Japan, South Korea, Turkey. The surprises to us were Italy, where support seemed very weak, and the US, where it also seemed very weak indeed, both in terms of support, professional development, or reward and recognition. That was the first cluster. The second cluster we defined as being nearer to the extended pole of professionality, where there was substantial support for supervisors in terms of initial professional development, if not continuing, and supervision was recognized and rewarded in a variety of ways. And that gave us a list of 6 countries: Australia, Canada, Denmark, Ireland. I think it's fair to say of all the countries, Ireland had, I think, the most advanced arrangements for support professional development of supervisors. It's a really interesting example of what can be achieved within a relatively small higher education system. Then Sweden, and then the UK. And then we had a third cluster, which we described as being in transition, ones which were historically at the restricted end of the pole. But in recent years, there have been major initiatives to improve support for supervisors and to reward and recognize them. So they were moving towards extended professionality. And the 5 we had there were France, Germany, Poland, Spain, and South Africa. And we looked at the reasons why these countries were in transition, and we identified 3 main factors. One was the association between doctoral education, the knowledge economy, and economic growth. A second major input was the Bologna process, and the influence there was very apparent in France, Germany, in Poland, and in Spain. The Bologna process, with the 3rd cycle, the reorganization consequent upon that, had promoted attention towards supervision and towards enhancing supervision. And then the other one was low completion rates and long completion times, which had affected matters in Poland and South Africa. The conclusions we drew from this were that criteria for supervisor selection were relatively similar across the case studies. In terms of professionality, the largest category were those at the restricted pole. There were 6 at the extended one, and then 5 in transition. And we found that in the transition cases, these changes were driven by Bologna, the knowledge economy, and the need to improve completion rates and times. With regard to the future, it seems those last 2 drivers seem to be shaping some of the changes in countries we identified as being closer to the restricted pole. And 2 in particular, I think, are well worth watching. In India, the University Grants Committee, which controls the funding for doctoral education, has put doctoral education under particular scrutiny, and doctoral supervision under scrutiny within that. And it's expected there'll be, in the near future, be a tightening up on eligibility and in requirements for professional development. That seems, as far as we can gather, to be driven as much as anything by the knowledge economy argument. And then in China, the issue has been somewhat different. The concern in China has been with the quality of dissertations and with the quality of supervision. And in the Ministry of Education in 2020, announced a crackdown on exploitative and abusive supervisors, gave students the right to change supervisors, and it gave universities the autonomy to introduce registers and annual reviews with training for supervisors. And just to say at the end, it would be interesting to repeat this study in 10 years' time and to see how far these and other countries currently near to the restricted pole have moved towards the extended pole of supervisory professionality. And that, I think, should leave us with about 15 minutes for questions, if you have any.